6 episodes ago, I told you about a crosswind landing I didn't do. I called in sick and went to play snooker. I told you that the transition to command is the most significant and least prepared for moment in a pilot's career. What I didn't tell you then, because it would have been a strange way to open a series, is that getting a command is, in some ways, the easy part. The hard part is what happens next. Not the first year, not the first difficult decision or the first intervention or the first time your crew comes to you with a problem that doesn't appear in any manual. What I'm talking about is the 10 years after that, the 20 years after that, the quiet, unremarkable accumulation of flights that don't challenge you, and what that does to a captain who stops paying attention. There's a term for it: standards drift. It's the most dangerous thing in aviation that almost nobody talks about. This episode is about that, and it's about what you do instead. There's a body of research into expert performance that produces a finding so counterintuitive that most people reject it on first hearing. More experience doesn't always mean better performance. But before I get to the research, let me give you a number. In the early days of powered flight, approximately 80% of accidents were caused by the machine. Mechanical failure, structural fault, design deficiency, and about 20% by the human. That ratio has since completely reversed. In modern commercial aviation, roughly 80% of accidents are attributed to human error. Of those, analysis of fatal accident data suggests that over 70% involve pilot factors, specifically poor judgment and decision-making. The engineering got better, the machines got safer. The remaining problem is us. Studies of expert practitioners across fields, medicine, music, chess, aviation, have found that performance doesn't automatically improve with time. In some cases, it plateaus. In others, it quietly declines. The mechanism is straightforward, without feedback, without active challenge, without something that forces you to confront the gaps in your understanding and close them. You stop improving. The pilot who's been flying the same routes in the same aircraft for 15 years has, in one sense, 15 years of experience. In another sense, the more honest one, they may have 1 year of experience repeated 15 times. Let me introduce you to 3 people you've almost certainly flown with. The first one, and I'll describe him rather than name him, though you'll recognize him immediately, would walk to the aircraft with the crew, enter the flight deck, wait for the first officer to sit down, and then leave. Walk back through the terminal, find a coffee shop, get a newspaper, and return, somewhere around pushback time. Whether he brought back 2 cups of coffee or 1 told you quite a lot about the first impression you'd made. I want to be careful here because this person wasn't a bad captain. He was experienced, he was competent, and by the time he returned, the aircraft was set up. The first officer had covered both sides. He'd established a system that worked from his perspective. But think about what that system communicates. Think about what it teaches. The less experienced pilot sitting next to him, the one who's just spent 45 minutes doing 2 people's jobs, is absorbing something about what command looks like, about what captains do, about what's acceptable. That's the first archetype, the active coaster. Not malicious, just done. The second one is subtler, and in some ways more interesting. This captain has immaculate SOPs, genuinely impressive procedural knowledge, precise call-outs, correct technique, everything by the book. The book from 2015. He didn't pick up the amendment that came in whenever it came in. He's been operating exactly the same way for more than 10 years because that's the way he's always done it. And the airline has absorbed it because he's experienced and generally reliable. Nobody's challenged it. His colleagues have noticed, but they filed it under, "Oh, that's just Jerry." Jerry doesn't know. Nobody told him. The gap between what Jerry does and what the manual currently says is real, and it's growing. And it'll stay invisible right up until the moment it isn't. Then there's the third one, the deliberate rogue. This person knows better. They've decided through experience, through their own analysis, through genuine conviction, that the approved procedure is suboptimal. And they've quietly replaced it with their own version. They're not incompetent. They're often very competent. That's what makes them dangerous. But here's what the deliberate rogue has done. In a world where an incident can result in years of investigation, litigation, and career consequences, they've removed their own protection. If you follow the approved procedure and something goes wrong, you could demonstrate that you did exactly what you were trained and authorized to do. If you've invented your own procedure, you can demonstrate no such thing. Procedures can be changed. The channels for doing that exist. If you genuinely believe something is wrong, you have every right to pursue that through the appropriate process. But until it's changed, the procedure is the procedure, and the deliberate rogue isn't pursuing anything through any process. He's just decided he knows better, quietly, without telling anyone. The through line across all three is the same. A feedback loop that's broken down. The coaster hasn't had anyone tell him that his absence sets a culture. Jerry hasn't had anyone tell him that he's out of date. The rogue has never had to defend his version of the procedure against the approved one in any formal context. They were all, at some point, good pilots. Some of them were excellent, but nobody told them when things started slipping, and so things kept slipping. The job becomes automatic, not in a useful, internalized expertise way, in a numbing way. You've flown this route so many times that the briefing is a formality rather than a preparation. You know what the weather's going to be. You know what the ATC environment's going to look like. You know exactly what the approach will feel like. There are no surprises, and in the absence of surprises, attention quietly retreats. The feedback loop that existed during training disappears. During your command course, everything you did was observed and assessed. Your errors had consequences. You were forced to confront your gaps. On the line, 15 years later, the last formal assessment was 3 months ago. The next one is 3 months away, and in between, nothing you do is being specifically watched. Seniority starts to feel like a credential rather than responsibility. Small drifts don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with a warning sign or a moment of obvious decision. They happen in tiny increments, a procedure slightly shortened here, a call-out slightly modified there, a step skipped once because there was a good reason, and then skipped again because it was skipped last time. And when nothing goes wrong, which usually doesn't, because aviation is genuinely very safe and the margins are generally wide, the drift is quietly validated. We did it that way, nothing happened, so we'll do it that way again, and then maybe a little further. There's a model for understanding how this propagates through a system. James Reason's Swiss cheese model, developed in the 90s and now foundational to aviation safety thinking, describes an organization's defenses against failure as a series of cheese slices, each with holes. The holes move, they change size. On most days they don't align, but when a small deviation becomes embedded practice, when the hole in one slice becomes a permanent fixture, the probability of alignment with the holes in every other slice quietly increases. The most dangerous version of this I want to name specifically because it deserves naming. It's called secondary minimums. It refers to the practice of reaching the minimum descent altitude on an instrument approach, point at which, if you don't have the required visual reference, you are legally and procedurally required to go around, and then waiting just a second or two just to see if the approach lights appear. That is a standards deviation that has been normalized at certain operations on certain routes, certain weather conditions, to the point where some pilots don't even register it as a deviation anymore. It is, unambiguously, operating below the approved minimum. It's exactly the kind of small, apparently consequence-free drift that looks entirely different when it's entered into an accident report. Briefing. This is perhaps the most visible daily marker of whether a captain is engaged or coasting. There is a briefing that goes, standard Heathrow 27 left, any questions? There are no questions because nobody's had time to think of any before the captain has moved on. Boxes are ticked, the procedure has been followed. There is a different briefing that starts by asking a different question. Not, are there any questions, but what's different about today? What's the one thing most likely to catch us out on this specific flight at this specific airport in these specific conditions? What's the threat we should be actively managing rather than hoping doesn't materialize? That briefing, the threat-based one, the interactive one, produces a different flight deck. I want to tell you about a hat. When I flew for it was something of a running joke that a pilot would visit the uniform stores, try on a cap by briefly shoving it under their arm, declare that it fit perfectly, and leave. The implication, which was entirely accurate, was that wearing the hat was considered optional for the experienced and unavoidable only for the junior. I brought that attitude with me when I moved to my current employer. My rationale, to the extent that I'd thought it through, was that hats weren't really meant to be worn indoors. That this was a perfectly defensible position, that it was a minor cosmetic matter with no operational significance whatsoever. Then I flew with an instructor from the Caribbean. Big character, someone who'd spent decades in the industry and had thought carefully about most of it. He had a view on the hat. He asked me whether I'd ever watched a salmon trying to swim upstream, whether I'd considered how much energy that required, how much resistance was involved, and what the salmon actually achieves at the end of it. Then he asked why I'd choose to swim upstream over something as small as a hat, when the downstream direction was so much easier and the water was going that way regardless. I wear the hat now. I don't love it. It's a minor inconvenience, and I have other minor inconveniences to concern myself with. But it's the approved procedure. It sets an example to the person sitting next to me. And the energy I was spending not wearing it, the small daily friction of being the person who quietly does things differently on that particular point, was energy I could spend on something more useful. The hat story isn't really about hats. It's about the accumulated cost of small resistances and the accumulated benefit of small compliances. Every procedural deviation, even the ones that seem entirely inconsequential, carries a cost. Sometimes the cost is operational, sometimes it's cultural. You're teaching the person next to you that this is how captains operate. And sometimes it's simply the energy of being the person who swims upstream when the stream is going somewhere reasonable. I have more than 13,000 hours. Some of those hours were genuinely formative. The first years on the A320, short haul, 4 sectors a day, all weather, a different captain every trip. That period taught me more about flying than almost anything before or since. And then some of those hours were spent in a bunk. Long-haul aviation is extraordinary in many ways. One of the less discussed ways is that it's possible to log meaningful flight time while you're asleep. Those hours exist, they're real, but they didn't develop anything. Research on expert performance across medicine, music, sport, professional chess, and yes, aviation, consistently finds the same thing. The experts who continue to improve into advanced experience are the ones who practice deliberately. The logbook doesn't know the difference. You do. The series has asked, across 6 episodes, a single question in different forms. What separates the captain, who merely holds the title, from the one who genuinely inhabits the role? This is Module 6, and the answer across all of them is the same. It's a choice. A choice to keep being the captain you were at your best, not the captain you can get away with being on a Tuesday morning on a route you've flown 40 times. That choice is available on every flight. It doesn't require a simulator session or a training course or a new model or a new framework. It just requires deciding again that this one matters. Every one of them does. If you're earlier in your career or thinking about entering aviation, the next set of videos on this channel will look at how people reach this seat in the first place and what airlines are actually selecting for when they choose who gets there. Subscribe if you haven't, and if this was worth your time, you know what to do. See you in the next one.